Well, I'm intrigued by the phrase that comes in the Acts of the Apostles, where Paul comes across an altar that has the words written on it, "To an unknown God." And Paul then uses this as an invitation to preach to the people of Athens about the God that he has experienced and known. And it says a lot about Athens, a very sophisticated, a very worldly and open society that was willing to remember and to admit that they didn't know everything, and that there might be gods out there that they wanted to honor that they were unaware of. And in thinking about that, I'd like to think a little bit this morning about what we know and what we don't know, what it means to be unknowing, both in terms of our knowledge, but also in terms of our spirituality and our life of faith. There's a wonderful English mystic who wrote a wonderful treatise called The Cloud of Unknowing that has as its premise that we come to faith by admitting what we don't know and being open to things that are unknown to us. So that brings me to a little bit of a story that I'd like to share with you. I knew in our time together that there would become something that was a severe breach of my pastoral responsibilities. I thought it might be oversleeping on Easter morning or moving the lectern, any of the things that usually get clergy in trouble. But for me, the humble vehicle was this last week's issue of The Mouse. In it, I reflected on a recent trip to Boston and spending some time at Harvard with Chris Mann, who's at the Harvard Divinity School. And in my weekly reflection, I talked about stopping on my way home to my hotel by a wonderful tower that was pealing bells. And I identified that as being the chapel at Winthrop College. Now, that began the tsunami of very kind but very clear corrective information about my ignorance about Harvard. First and foremost, it was not Winthrop College, it was Lowell House. And it is not Lowell College because there are not colleges, there are houses at Harvard. And it is not a chapel because it has a bell tower and a steeple above it. Most of the houses at Harvard have clock towers. Lowell House is the only one that has a set of bells. As Chris Mann reflected to me, Richard, obviously Harvard is a minefield for you. My understanding of my ignorance was then also compounded because I came from a place where, in my experience of Yale, when you had a tower that was above a building that had bells in it, that was probably either the gymnasium, the library, or possibly a chapel, but not so at Harvard. So I was reminded there's a lot I don't know. How do we know then things that are even more important, perhaps, except in the mind of Harvard graduates, information that informs our life of faith? How do we come to admit what we know and what we don't know, especially if we don't know what we don't know? It's actually an existential question. And the answer that Paul gives is we figure it out together. We work at it together in community to understand and to know things. We don't depend on our own individual knowledge, but we respect the knowledge and the experience and the perspective of the faith community in which we live. So we figure out together what we know and what we don't know. And clearly, as the mystic who wrote The Cloud of Unknowing suggests, it's a journey that is part of our life, our human life, and our spiritual life together. And so, what do we know about God? Well, we do know everything that was taught to us by Jesus in the Gospels. We have his teachings, his example, the words he spoke, the miracles he did, the way he was with people. What he taught us about how, in his understanding, our relationship with God could be the most profound and deep it possibly could be. So we have all that. We also have clarity and know what Jesus is saying. We're often like the disciples who don't get it the first time, but Jesus really is pretty clear in the Gospels about what we need to know. We need to know that we are here as the hands of God. We are here in this world to make God known, not necessarily in the teaching of theology, but the way that we live our lives, both individually and our life in community. And what are we supposed to do as the hands of God? Well, again, Jesus makes it pretty clear. We're meant to alleviate suffering. We're meant to assist the people who are vulnerable. We need to offer healing and love to the world. And we need to celebrate examples of courage and heroism for people who have taught us more about the profound nature of God's love. So knowing this, knowing what we're about, is not the whole story, however, because how we live that out is part of the unknowing. That's where we often get tripped up. That's where it's not clear to us what the best course of action might be. So we as a church, we as a faith community, and we as individuals must be willing to admit that we don't know everything. I know it's hard for Episcopalians, especially hard for Episcopalians who have gone to Harvard. But it is true that we don't know everything. We live a life of unknowing. And that's a wonderful opportunity. It's an opportunity to grow in our understanding, to change, to be viable, to be reactive to people who teach us more than we didn't know we didn't know. And we do that together. And it means sometimes we make mistakes and we misstep. Sometimes we miss opportunities. Sometimes we make bad decisions. But the posture spiritually of saying we live in what is unknown, but know something for certain. And what we know for certain is that we believe and proclaim and celebrate a God that is love, unconditional love for humanity. And as long as we remain true to that certainty, all the rest of it that needs to be puzzled and figured out, all the rest of it that really is the stuff of life, both in terms of the way we lead our daily lives, but also in our spiritual lives, will become clearer. We live a life of journeying and exploration, of saying we understand this God of love is manifested in the world around us. And our prayer should always be that God would open our hearts and our minds to new understandings, grounded in something as unshakable as God's unconditional love for all of us. Amen.